Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm going to introduce our speaker. His name is Jim Caeser, and he's the Harry F. Byrd Professor of Politics and Director of the Program on Constitutionalism and Democracy at the University of Virginia, where he's taught since 1976. Dr. Caeser is also a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, a former presidential appointee at the National Archives, and a recipient of the Bradley Prize and the Jean Kirkpatrick Award for Academic Freedom, in addition to having taught at Oxford, Princeton, Harvard, the University of Basel, and the University of Bordeaux. His academic and journalistic writings are far too numerous to list here, but it suffices to say that he's written some of the most influential books in the field of American political thought, including Presidential Selection, Liberal Democracy and Political Science, Reconstructing America, Designing a Polity, and Nature and History in American Political Development. He received his PhD in government from Harvard University and his BA from Kenyon College. If all you knew about Professor Caeser is what his impressive academic resume states, then in my view, you wouldn't know the most important thing about him. James Caeser is more than a mere academic or professor of politics. He is in many ways his own pedagogical institution, whose students teach in universities and serve in government in communities across the United States. Throughout his long career, he has devoted himself to showing the ways in which political theory and political ideas affect political practice, and thus to showing why studies of philosophy, history, theology, and law are crucial components of any university education that is worth its tuition dollars. It is not an overstatement to say that Professor Caeser has devoted his career to the education not merely of students, but of future citizens of the Republic to whose maintenance he has given his life. Perhaps the most remarkable and underappreciated aspect of his career is that he's accomplished the task of educating these citizens without a hint of the academic pretension and political radicalism that characterize many in the professoriate today. Dr. Caeser speaks, teaches, and writes about politics in a language that is free of confusing jargon, welcoming to all political persuasions, and laden with a wit and charm that has endeared and edified generations of students at the university that Thomas Jefferson himself built. Please join me in welcoming to the University of Colorado, Professor James Caeser.
Well, thanks, Shiloh, for that very kind introduction. Shiloh worked under me at the University of Virginia for a couple of years, so I have a little bit of a hold on him, but it's a very nice introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, I guess this afternoon, late afternoon, at Boulder. Well, Americans regularly speak today of our founding and our founders. Our founders are everywhere. They're honored on monuments, large and small, and commemorated by the names of countless schools and streets, none more iconic than Madison Avenue. This focus on founding is rare in the world today. There were, of course, a founder of the Communist Soviet Union, Lenin, of Fascist Italy, Mussolini, of National Socialist Germany, Hitler, but these regimes are no more. Ataturk, hailed once as the great founder of modern Turkey, has largely been erased by Erdogan, and Mao Zedong just barely hangs on in China. In the democracies, there's still a place for Gandhi in India, Mandela in South Africa, and perhaps Havel in the Czech Republic and de Gaulle in France. But the other European nations, like Britain or Netherlands, have grown into their current condition without a founder. So with its attention on being founded, America today is more the exception than the rule. Unlike most other states, America has made founding a central theme of its political science. Yet, Americans are remarkably imprecise when it comes to assigning the label of a founder. To whom should it apply? For most, a founder refers to an important political figure who helped the nation get started. At an Independence Day celebration on July 4th, between enjoying grilled hot dogs and viewing fireworks, Thomas Jefferson is almost sure to be mentioned. But no one would take exception if George Washington, James Madison, or Alexander Hamilton were added to the list. These men and others too are variously considered founders, having played a role in establishing and helping embellish a new political order. Let's try, however, for a little bit more precision than the average American has in mind. Founding can refer to three key moments in the establishment of the nation: the Revolution, the writing and ratification of the Constitution, and the launching of the government and passage of the Bill of Rights. The founding period, therefore, runs from the Battle of Lexington in 1775 through the end of Washington's first term in 1793. Those who merit the designation of founders include our revolutionary leaders, people like Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, and Washington, the principal figures who prepared and defended the Constitution, Madison, Washington, and Hamilton, and the political actors who afterwards helped shape the new federal government in its critical first years, Washington, Hamilton, and Madison. Now, if someone demanded to know which one of these three moments should be designated the founding, most historians, I suppose, would probably give the prize to the constitutional period of 1787 and 1788. At the center of this event was James Madison, the person subsequently labeled the father of the Constitution. Madison was essential in promoting the formation of a new government and in defining the terms of the debate at the Philadelphia Convention. Along with Hamilton, he was the main author of the Federalist, which explained and defended the Constitution during the ratification contest. Feeling duty-bound by an implicit agreement reached in many states during the ratification debate, Madison also was the chief force in Congress in 1790 and 1791 in pushing for a Bill of Rights. James Madison is the subject of my talk this afternoon, but less for serving as a principal founder than for introducing the conception of founding, or law-giving as it's sometimes called, into American thought. Before there could be a founding, there had to be an idea of founding. That idea had to become part of our way of thinking. Madison provided the intellectual breakthrough. He is the founder in America of the idea of founding. Now, this fact goes unrecognized today, as no one thinks that the idea of founding ever needed to be established. Founding is taken for granted by Americans and regarded as perfectly natural. We speak of the founding and the founders for the reason we believe that we had a founding and founders. But was the connection between preparing a written constitution and founding regularly made in 1787? Did Americans associate what was being done at the time with the instances of founding or lawmaking that had been accomplished in antiquity by the likes of Moses in the desert of Sinai, like Kyrgyz in ancient Sparta, or Solon in Athens? Does the language of founding and lawmaking fit so readily and easily with these classical examples? The truth, I believe, is that this terminology of founding was rarely employed in America before 1787. Almost no one, for example, used the language of founders to designate those who wrote America's first national constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Was John Dickinson, the primary author of the Articles, ever honored as a founder? John Adams perhaps saw himself as a founder when he wrote the Constitution of Massachusetts in 1780. But no one else, with the possible exception of Abigail, saw him in this way. The idea of founding, far from being self-evident to all, had to be revived and promoted in 1787 and 1788. It had to be brought back. Reintroducing this language belongs to the authors of the Federalist and above all to James Madison. It was Madison who took up the theme of the lawgiver and began comparing America's constitutional writers to the seminal lawgivers of antiquity. Madison's purpose was to have Americans view the events unfolding before them through the lens of the idea of lawmaking, with all its connotations of extraordinary action and bold remaking. Madison refined the idea of founding and suggested, really audaciously, that the America's founding rivaled and might in the end even replace the models of founding of the ancient world. Without this step, those we call our founders today might not be known as founders at all. I now want to introduce for a moment the concept of founding. Founding or lawmaking was one of the fundamental themes of classical political science. Lawmaking was understood as an effort of an individual to bring into being good government, or at any rate the best government possible under an existing set of circumstances. Two elements might be involved in the act of founding. First, there was the acquisition of knowledge of what promoted good government. In the case of the founding of Sparta, as described by the Roman historian Plutarch, the greatest of founders, a person by the name of Lycurgus, made an extensive voyage around the Aegean Sea. Before undertaking his task of founding, he studied different forms of government in the islands there and considered which might be best for his native land. In Crete, Lycurgus consulted the philosopher Thales, who had begun to elaborate a science of politics that studied the best regime and good regimes and how they could be established. The person in antiquity who developed knowledge of regimes, Aristotle is probably the most illustrious example, may be thought of as teachers of lawgivers. They are, if you will, proto or invisible founders, standing behind the actual founders and giving them advice. Now, the second dimension of founding is the action of actually executing the task, which is the task of the founder, properly speaking. Perhaps this person has availed himself of knowledge, as Lycurgus did with Thales, or perhaps he founded without this knowledge, proceeding by his own wits and doing the best he could. In any case, founding is only partly capable of being mapped out in advance by theoretical knowledge. Given the importance of particular circumstances in actual situations, the facts on the ground will often dictate strategies. Knowledge only serves as a partial guide for action. Gauging the situations they face, some lawgivers decided to settle for much less than they might have wished for. According to Madison and the Federalists, the Athenian founder Solon confessed that he had, and I'll quote Madison here, not given his countrymen the government best suited to their happiness, but most tolerable to their prejudices. On the other hand, Madison remarks, Lycurgus remained more true to his object. This led him to take chances and to use, Madison says, violence and the authority of superstition to accomplish his objectives. Lycurgus founded Sparta by resorting to extraordinary measures, including the use of force, that were at odds with the principles on which he based the Spartan political system. Sparta was founded with violence, but was set up to operate without violence. There was thus a potential tension between the act of founding and the regime that was established. Let's take a look now at how some famous political theorists later dealt with this idea of founding. Niccolo Machiavelli is one of the most famous cases. He reformulated the classic account of founding and gave the subject his own special points of emphasis. Machiavelli brought the motives of the founder into the equation, asking how the task of founding might fulfill a founder's own interests, something the ancients did not fully consider. No longer did Machiavelli assume that founders acted automatically to do good for their compatriots without achieving something for themselves. Founders had to get something. They had to acquire their own glory and renown. The founders' goals had to be squared with promoting the public good. In line with the ancients, Machiavelli also set out two general dimensions of founding. First, founding was aided by theoretical knowledge that Machiavelli called the rules for the government of princes. Machiavelli offered his own political science as the best source of instruction, insisting that it was superior to anything the classics did because it was more realistic. It took its bearings from how people actually live rather than how they should live. The one who possesses this knowledge, though he does not literally act, is the proto or invisible founder. That was Machiavelli himself. Second, Machiavelli turns to the actual founders, the actors who engage in the activity of founding. In his book, The Prince, Machiavelli depicts this person as one who makes his way by the use of his own arms and ability. The greatest of founders, he says, were Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and their like. These figures, he said, took the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. In his discourses, another book on Livy, Machiavelli discusses these leaders under the name of founders or foundatori and specifies all their attributes and behavior. A defining characteristic of a founder, Machiavelli tells us, is that he almost always acts by himself. Founding is an individual activity, not the work of a committee. This fact allows Machiavelli to excuse the actions of Romulus, who famously murdered his brother Remus. Romulus was the founder of Rome. We must assume, Machiavelli wrote, that it never or rarely happens that a republic or monarchy is well constituted or its institutions entirely reformed unless it is only done by one individual. It is even necessary that he whose mind has conceived such a constitution should be alone in carrying it into effect. Founding is an act of enormous difficulty, requiring an extraordinary degree of authority. Yet a founder often begins without holding any office. His authority eventually derives from taking advantage of what Machiavelli calls an opportunity, meaning a situation in which a people is faced with dire circumstances. These circumstances either already exist or the founder helps to create them. An opportunity is sometimes known today as a crisis, which, as everyone knows, is a terrible thing to waste. Opportunities create a situation in which people are disposed to follow. This spontaneous inclination only lasts so long, however, until things get difficult. People then grow discontented and wish to be rid of the founder, as when Moses faced rebellions in the desert from those who had willingly followed him out of Egypt. At some point, Machiavelli observes, a founder will need to assure his authority by compelling obedience. As he says, things must be ordered in such a mode that when the people no longer believe, one can make them believe by force. Force consists of the use of physical arms or of psychological control, most often by manipulating religious beliefs to instill fear. Founding for Machiavelli can take place on different levels. It can refer to changing the frame of government inside of an existing state, as when a founder comes in, as Lenin did, and changed Russia from an aristocratic order governed by a czar into a communist state. Or it can mean a founder who establishes an altogether new nation in political form, as Moses did when he took the enslaved Hebrews from Egypt and formed them into a people ready to conquer Israel. Or finally, it can mean transforming an entire culture or civilization, as occurred when the Christian era was replaced and replaced the previous pagan era, or when the current post-Christian Enlightenment era has been replacing and displacing the Christian era. Founding, in this last sense, takes one beyond politics in the ordinary sense of a change in who holds direct physical power over others. It refers to the actions of one engaged in a project so vast that no single person can ever hope to accomplish it himself within a lifetime. Such a founder must proceed by propagating a new religious message or by proclaiming a new set of theoretical ideas. This thinker-actor induces others to carry out parts of the project, perhaps without their even realizing its origins. Here we have a type of invisible founder who makes his message active. He becomes, as it were, a real founder, exercising influence across generations, bringing into being a new mode and order. The examples might be Jesus, or perhaps Paul, who preached Christianity, which replaced the pagan mode and order, and then Machiavelli himself, whose new theoretical doctrines helped inaugurate the Enlightenment project that has slowly replaced Christianity. Now, a little further on in history, Rene Descartes was the thinker who inaugurated the Enlightenment project within the realm of philosophy. He offered an account of the lawgiver that extended Machiavelli's analysis. Early in his discourse on method, Descartes describes his ideal of a city planner who's a kind of stand-in for a founder. Descartes wrote, "There is not so much perfection in works created by the hands of various masters as there is in those in which one person has worked on it alone. Thus we see that the buildings which a single architect has undertaken and completed are usually much more beautiful and better ordered than those which several people have tried to do by refurbishing old walls built for other purposes." Descartes then goes on to suggest building cities in places in which an engineer has designed freely on level ground. So Descartes' lawmaker, again, is a single person who tears everything down and begins de novo. Relying on a science likened to engineering, which supplies exact answers, the founder rebuilds without being constrained by custom or by ancient structures. The scenes of violence that Machiavelli so delighted in go unmentioned, as the founder eliminates the past and builds the new city from scratch. Descartes presents the technocrat's dream of founding operating with complete rational control, unimpeded by the wishes and views of the many. Finally, one could mention JeanJacques Rousseau, who envisaged the lawmaker in the most extraordinary of terms. Rousseau depicts the founder once again as acting on his own, seeing further than all others. Founders are responsible for establishing an entire system, far surpassing the accomplishments of statesmen who only put into effect what the founder has created. The founder himself should never try to govern. His task is to set up the new system, after which he disappears from the scene. Few possess the genius to perform this function, which demands, quoting Rousseau, the ability to change human nature, so to speak, to transform each individual, who on his own is a complete and solitary whole, into part of a much greater whole, from which he, in a way, receives his life and his being. The founder's task exceeds in difficulty what any other political actor attempts to do. Executing a plan of founding must be fitted carefully to the needs of each place, which vary greatly. A science of politics, according to Rousseau, takes one only so far. Founding must generate an authority that goes beyond what reason and argument could ever persuade a people to do. Artistic or poetic insight is required. A founder may need to rely on physical force, but the project will always depend heavily on claims that invoke religious sanction. I'd like to turn to British thought on founding, which is important in America. British political thought in the 17th and 18th centuries featured two schools of thought known as contract theory and organic development. In both, the founder has been completely eliminated. This step may have been taken with a deliberate strategy in mind of discouraging would-be Machiavellian leaders from unsettling the political world. Or both schools may have concluded that founding was an artifice or fiction, at least in modern times. Whichever the case, these schools broke from classical political science and presented their political teachings without the figure of the lawgiver who vanishes. Americans in the late 18th century, as we'll see, relied greatly on British political thought, but Madison and the Federalists differed by bringing back the concept of founding. Contract theory, deriving largely from John Locke, held that governments formed by individuals voluntarily coming together on the basis of reasoned calculation of how best to secure their primary rights, above all a right to life or personal safety, and a right to the preservation of property. The creation of a sound political order is assisted by a science of politics, which becomes known in a simplified form by the public and which helps in the actualization of the new state. The science explains how people living in a state of nature, which is a situation without government, transition into civil government. This model might eventually be adopted everywhere. Setting up a civil society has no need of a great founder endowed with extraordinary authority. The origination of government is routinized and accomplished in a reasonable and semiotic way by people coming together and creating a social compact. Contract theory replaces a model of politics that relied on a founder. Resting on the logic of reason and interest, the contract formed among citizens largely eliminates chance. No longer is there a need for a singular person of extraordinary political genius to act. Waiting for a great heroic lawgiver to appear, which can never be guaranteed, is now unnecessary. If certain minimal conditions obtain, chiefly the elimination of priestly control and religious superstition, the establishment of a sound civil order should follow. Organic theory may be less familiar to you. It's also known as Whig jurisprudential history, was the other school of political thought in Britain at the time. It taught that the English Constitution had formed gradually over time as a product of accident and of piecemeal adjustment. England, by this account, never had a single moment when it began. It had no founding or founders. Its origins lay somewhere back when, whether in the famed forests of Germany among the Gothic tribes that later conquered Britain, or at some other time memorial point prior to the advent of clear records. England's magnificent constitution then grew by trial and error. Human intelligence appeared along the way to produce what Edmund Burke called reforms, which introduced adjustments and partial corrections. There was no such thing, however, as a wholesale transformation or a deliberate act to begin the political order anew. Organic theory further argued that a science of politics is unequal to the task of founding a new order. The process is just too complex, beyond what any human being, regardless of intelligence, can manage. In addition, the extraordinary authority needed to carry out the task of founding represents a threat to liberty. Founding destroys restraint and collectivizes all power in the hands of the founders, who accomplishes a founding often using force or fraud. However much a founder may seek to decentralize power in the political system he creates, the example of the beginning will live on and sanction later attempts to destroy free government. Proponents of the organic theory presented their account of English constitutional development as actual history. Perhaps this claim reflected their honest understanding of what had happened, but it may also represent a constructed narrative that was designed to conceal parts of the past and help people gloss over the enormity and radicalness of an event like the Glorious Revolution. The organic school seems to have been less concerned with perfect accuracy than with presenting, in the guise of history, the teachings of its political philosophy. Fake history, as a famous contemporary might put it. Organic theory was meant to dampen the enthusiasm Machiavelli had created to make ambitious men think of clean slates and new beginnings. Moderation was the organic theorist's watchword. To this end, organic theory eliminated the founder and founding. Burke explained that the British Constitution had not been formed, I quote, upon a regular plan or with any unity of design, but instead grew in a great length of time and by a great variety of accidents. As if in opposition to Descartes, Burke was partial to the crooked and narrow streets of old, preferring them to the neat and sterile models of the plans of engineers, or for that matter, to the cultivation of the egotistical genius of modern architects. As for ever founding, Burke expressed his opposition with notable directness. The very idea of fabrication of a new government, he said, is enough to fill us with disgust and horror. Let's now come to the crux of it, which is the American idea of founding. American political thought in the late 18th century, under Madison's guidance, brought the theme of founding back into political science, breaking with the two schools of English thought. For all that Americans had borrowed from the English, this difference divided and still divides America and Britain. It separates their traditions of conservatism, with Americans celebrating a deliberate beginning and the British anchoring their constitutional system in custom and evolution. Americans accept the concept of founding, the British do not. The Federalist, America's most important work of political thought, rejects the claim of organic theory that political constitutions are the result of unplanned growth and accident. The book's opening paragraph announces that the outcome to the debate over ratification will determine, and here I'll give a long quote from Federalist 1, will determine whether societies of men are capable or not of establishing good government from reflection or choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. The Federalists obviously preferred reflection and choice, positing that intentional or deliberate founding is in fact possible. Now, America's founders were certainly not wild-eyed idealists, eager to reject what was old and customary just because it was old and customary. Yet they made clear that when necessary, they would follow a new course. The Constitution marked a potential pivot point in world history, establishing the system of modern liberal democracy. Madison reminded his readers what the revolutionary leaders had set in motion. Happily, he wrote, for America. Happily, we trust, for the whole human race. They pursued a new and more noble course. They accomplished a revolution which has no parallels in the annals of human history. They reared the fabrics of government which have no model on the face of the globe. It was now necessary, Madison argued, to complete their job. The Federalist divergence from the other school of British thought, contract theory, is a bit more complicated. American thinkers at the time regularly turned to John Locke to discuss the origin of government, and they often fit the revolution into the framework of his theory of the social compact. This is in every textbook. Yet the act of establishing a new government went well beyond what Locke had sketched out. Without the deliberate exertions of a small number of men, that is, without founders, a new constitution would never have been proposed. The plan for a new government in America was not the result of spontaneous action by the mass of citizens, but the product of a deliberate action by a few lawmakers. The Federalists' embrace of the concept of founding returned the idea of greatness to the center of political life, and it restored in the process a claim of rank and hierarchy between founders and people. There were now great men performing great deeds at a critical moment. Everything hinged on their deliberate action. The Federalists also defended a new kind of political figure to admire. It's one who combines knowledge of the science of politics, judgment in determining where theoretical knowledge applies to existing circumstances, and persistence and boldness in pursuing the nation's interest. The authors of the Federalists were subtly presenting a picture of themselves. The theme of founding culminates in James Madison's explicit introduction of the lawgiver in Federalist number 38. Madison provided a list of 14 ancient reformers or lawgivers, examining cases in which government has been established with deliberation and consent. The list includes Theseus, Lycurgus, Solon, and Romulus. Madison then proceeds to compare America's founders with these renowned figures of antiquity. He casts a glance then at the future. If the Constitution would be ratified, American founders would become not just the worthy rivals of the ancients, but superior models to others, in light of what Madison claimed were the improvements made by Americans on the ancient mode of preparing and establishing regular plans of government. The argument for the preeminence of American founders is seen from how the task of founding was to be carried out. Beginning with the issue of the number of founders, Madison recalled that for the ancients, the task of framing had always been performed by some one individual of preeminent wisdom and approved integrity, never by an assembly of men. In opting, by contrast, for a select body of persons at the conventions, Americans entrusted the task of founding to a few persons, not to one. Madison conceded that this method risked creating discord and disunion, as in fact occurred more than a few times at the convention, necessitating compromises. But it offered the prospect of achieving more wisdom, he thought, through dialogue, and greater consensus in favor of an outcome. Now, when it comes to the question of how a plan of government was to be adopted, ancient practice ranged from founders who tried to discern what a people would agree to, which limited what they could propose, to founders who abandoned consent altogether and relied on compulsion, seeking greater perfection. Madison admitted having admiration for the founders who used force, but this approach was impossible in America. The founders in 1787 lacked the means to compel. There was no national army under their control, and all that was left to them was persuasion. Nor did the American founders appeal to a supernatural or unnatural force working in their favor, unless one counts the providential fact of having George Washington on their side. Seeking consent in the ratification process brought an additional benefit. No gap or tension now existed between the act of founding in America and the subsequent system of rule under the Constitution. Both were based on Republican principles. Ratification became a means to create a social contract, setting a precedent for other modern republics. You vote on your founding. Note how this process contrasts with the methods followed within the European Union, where referenda by the publics of member states have been ignored in revisions of the European project. Madison's examination of ancient examples of founding confirmed what he had learned at the convention. Founding, even under the most favorable circumstances, revealed, I cite him here, the hazards and difficulties incident to such experiments and the great imprudence of unnecessarily multiplying them. This conclusion prepared Madison to take a new and decisive step. In the process of writing the Federalist, he undertook, acting in the fashion of a classic founder by himself, to set out a new meaning of what exactly a written constitution should be. To avoid repeating the great difficulties of founding, Madison proposed that the Constitution should be regarded, here's terms he used, with veneration and with reverence, and not easily or frequently altered. With deepening support that comes with age, the Constitution would have the prejudices of the community on its side. The instrument of a written constitution, superior to statutory law and changeable only by a process separate from ordinary lawmaker, was an American innovation that developed in the states in the period after the Revolution. Yet this fact never extended to the idea that a written constitution should be thought of as an enduring document and a symbol that would connect future generations to the founding moment. Even today, a written constitution is not automatically associated with something that should be treated with great respect or reverence. In many of the states, people have no such feelings, nor are they expected to. Constitutions in some states are easily amended, and many of them have been rewritten in full. It would take a person of peculiar temperament and perhaps questionable sanity to venerate the Constitution of California. Madison's idea of forging a connection between veneration and the Constitution deepened while he was writing the Federalist Papers. It emerged in response to the planned circulation of Thomas Jefferson's book, Notes on the State of Virginia, a book which proposed a very low threshold for revising the Constitution. Jefferson, in fact, had a wholly different idea of what a written constitution was. He regarded written constitutions more as ordinary law, supreme in their legal status, yes, but ordinary in the sense that, like statutory law, they would be regularly updated and improved. Jefferson proposed elsewhere that every constitution should be rewritten and ratified every generation. Reverence for the Constitution and for its founders, he believed, imprisoned the public mind. It favored the disposition to accept past authority and fostered superstition. Jefferson mocked this kind of subservience, later famously writing, "Some men look at Constitution with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment." Like many progressives at the turn of the 20th century who followed Jefferson's sentiments and borrowed his language, placing founders on a pedestal and venerating their document should at all costs be rejected. The persons living today will possess greater political wisdom than those who lived in the past, and those who lived in the future will have greater wisdom than those living today. For Jefferson, laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. If there was a prevailing understanding of what a written constitution was in 1787, before Madison wrote, it may well have been his idea. James Madison offered a new and different view. No blind worshiper of ancestors, Madison nevertheless saw no reason to defy prudence and invite constant constitutional revisions. Better, he said, to respect an achievement that was made, shield it from undue pressure of change, and protect it from the future actions of those likely to possess far less political intelligence. Even more important, reverence for the Constitution affects how people think of the entire political world around them. It helps create a certain attitude, or to use a fancy term, a certain political epistemology. It encourages citizens to look to and to value the past, a past that in this instance provided near as much as one could hope for. Without this disposition, it's hard to imagine that we could ever have had founders at all. Thank you.
Questions, and he'll take his own questions, so feel free to continue. Oh, you need to speak into the microphone, too. Yeah. Yeah? This one in the back. You have to do the part as possible.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you for that talk. Okay, thanks. I was wondering if you could say more about the distinction between founders plural and founders singular. I was struck by the extent to which all previous thinkers on the founding thought it was critical to have, a single founder, and then this switch to multiple founders. But I wonder too if in your singling out Madison, the idea is in your mind there was really one founder, and that was key to the success of the founding, or just what you think the pros and cons are, if you could talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, well, in almost all these classical cases, the founders identified with a single person, as I mentioned, and not a committee. So that's why Romulus killed Remus and Machiavelli exonerates him. You needed just one founder, had to get rid of the brother. And so this was a theme in the political science of founding, let's say, of the classics and many of the moderns who took up their ideas. Madison wants to write about founding now and reintroduce it in 1787 and 1788. But of course, just to take the circumstances, America doesn't have one founder. It has, say, a few. I know you could count everyone at the convention, but to put it seriously, there were 3 or 4 or 5 that were most significant. So you could say he's compelled to defend the idea that founding can be an act of a small committee. But he also introduces a couple of arguments for why this could be better. I mentioned those arguments. Maybe they're made-up arguments to cover the circumstances, but they make some sense. He argues that when you have a group of people, you risk disunion. People can disagree, but you maybe can get more wisdom if there's good dialogue. And if you read through the notes on the convention, I don't know, you could say, was Madison's original plan that he came in with into the convention, was that superior to the product that finally emerged? Hard to say, but they spent 3 months discussing the idea of the founding, and they seemed to learn a lot from each other, and in any case, to create the compromises that would allow the Constitution to pass. So he makes an argument, Madison, therefore, for a group of founders, changing the notion of founding from the classical idea. And this is the argument he puts forward as the modern idea. He says we had improvements over the position of the ancients. And he proposes this idea as something that others now could emulate. And I think it's pretty much true in the world that, you look at the world as a whole, that in modern times, that America's founders have replaced Romulus, maybe not Moses, Romulus and Lycurgus. I don't find very many of my students walking around talking about Lycurgus. Maybe at Michigan State they do, where they're still Spartans. And there's a statue of Sparty right outside the campus, but that usually applies to the football team rather than to the actual act of founding. That's more in that vein. So that's basically his argument.
In light of the movement recently toward, there seems to be an increased movement toward a living constitution. I'm interested whether you think that is good or bad, and in spite of what you think, either good or bad, is it inevitable? Is it going to happen?
Now, living constitution. Now, it's impossible to say exactly what Madison favored in this regard. There's some people trying to invoke him as a rigorous defendant of originalism. I don't know if they conceived of the problem in that term. What I do suspect is that the role of the judiciary is far larger than anything the founders probably imagined, and its scope and authority are greater. I mean, that has to do with a lot of changes that took place in the Constitution by amendment, and the 14th Amendment, and bringing everything in, such that everything becomes a federal question in the old saying. big federal question. For example, something that happened in the student council at the University of Virginia reached the Supreme Court as if it was some great matter. All this enters now through the 14th Amendment. So it's a much larger scope for the judiciary, and therefore lawyers support the Constitution as it's interpreted by the courts, rather than the struggles and mechanisms that the founders set forth. And we have lots of lawyers, much prestige, good incomes, maybe little thought, but in any case, they're doing quite well. So that's a tough question. As for the future, this is being battled out, as we speak in the court, with some taking a more originalist position and others opposed to an original position. And so I guess it'll turn out in the next period that we enter on who's the president and who he nominates as judges. For the long term, who's to say? But there's something to be said in the arguments on both sides. But I think for the time being, everything will depend on the fates of the political situation.
Yeah, I'm just kind of interested.
Wait, we're bringing the. Can you bring it up here, and then we'll get to that gentleman next. Thank you. Go to it.
Yeah. No, I'm just kind of interested in how atoms fit into that equation between Jefferson and Madison.
Yeah, well, Adam was he wasn't at the Constitutional Convention. He was in England, and nor was Jefferson at the Constitutional Convention, which is interesting because I think that allowed Madison, who's kind of a retiring figure, to step into his own, to come into his own. It's like when two stars are down, next man up. And it was Madison. He came into his own at the convention and showed his brilliance. But I think, it's fair to say that the two most respected political minds at the time were Jefferson and Adams. And Adams was not as gifted a writer as Jefferson, that's for sure, but much more of a scholar of politics in the political arena. Wrote a lot of books, big books on politics, and presented a lot of political views. He was, you could say, before Madison came on the scene, the real political scientist in America, the one who fancied himself to a political scientist. So that's where I would put Adams. Maybe a little bit difficult to get along with others. He had some difficulty in getting along with others, but a mind of the first rank. As for Jefferson, if you ask him, I'm sure he would say he was a mind of the first rank. He was generally, in all of his activities, you could say he was a Renaissance man, and a great authority on wines. That's but also in philosophy, and had great knowledge of philosophy. In fact, if you wanted to be a little bit cynical, I would never do this coming from the University of Virginia, but if you wanted to, you could begin by asking, why did Jefferson call himself the author of the Declaration of Independence, which is an exaggeration? It was a committee that wrote the Declaration. Jefferson was responsible for the draft and for producing that draft, but considerable changes were made. And I don't know if many people today would step forward and claim that they were the author when others were involved in writing the Constitution. That's pretty bold. And we know that Jefferson did it himself because he wrote the words that appear on his tombstone, where he said Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. So he claimed that, realizing that it would give him a good deal of renown. And since I mentioned founding and Jefferson's opposition to venerating the Constitution, it would be fair to point out that Jefferson said only one thing remains supreme and should never change. Everything else changes, including Constitution. It's better to get rid of them. They're just an anachronism. But one thing remains supreme, and that's the Declaration of Independence. So you could look at it this way, that Jefferson was dispatching or getting rid of the founders of 1787 and 1788. After all, who's a founder if you found something that lasts for 10 or 15 years? You're no longer a founder. And putting himself in the position of the author of the only document which is enduring, therefore the only true founder, which is Thomas Jefferson. And I guess that's how he's revered in Charlottesville.
So you mentioned how Madison has Madison and American founders have replaced the ancient founders, and talking about Jefferson, how you shouldn't venerate the founders, and how people in the future always have a better understanding of political science. As someone in the future, from the standpoint of the American founders, what do you think can be changed to improve our...
Okay, I put your microphone a little closer to your, yeah. I got everything up to the last part.
As someone who has the benefit of time from the American founders, what do you think can be changed or improved about our political system?
What would I be saying to?
What do you think can be changed or improved about our political system?
Yeah, well, I mean, things can be changed. I didn't want to say that Madison said nothing could be changed. That would be an extreme position. We have an amendment process, and therefore he was open to change, but he wanted to create a disposition to look back to the essential document and keep it, which we have in a large part. I mean, we still have the Constitution. We've added a few things, a few amendments, and made some really important changes. But the basic structure of the Constitution remains, and it's been a long time since it was written, and it hasn't been altered. So that's what I think Madison was after. He wasn't so tied to the past that nothing should ever be transformed. And he didn't believe that there wasn't some degree of trial and error in the course of human affairs. So some of the changes we made are obviously good changes. Some of them maybe not, but the Civil War amendments were clearly decisive in American history, and it played a very important role. Others could still be contested. I don't know about electing senators or having them elected by state legislatures. You can debate on either side. And then there's a heck of a lot of amendments. I forget what they are. Something's about when you should be paid and not paid. Small stuff. So people are debating different things. Probably the most important debate today is on the Electoral College and how that should be considered, and other things like that. And these debates will go on. I don't want to take up your time with giving my opinions on issues like that. Each is a separate question. But I think that gives a better idea maybe than I expressed in my talk about Madison's views. He wasn't a worshiper of ancestors, a respecter, let's call them, of ancestors.
I want to ask for some clarification. I was wondering if you could say more on how Madison understood the superiority of American founding over and against the ancients. And the second question I want to ask you is whether or not there is disagreement about the need for virtue in the population to make the Constitution work, whether or not there's disagreement amongst leading founders, right, the 4 or 5 that you think are preeminent amongst the generation?
Yeah, on the first question, of course, I suppose you would say it was superior in part because the regime established, which he thought a modern liberal democracy was a better regime than some of the ones that the ancients had created. After all, it's hard to compare the two cases. We speak of democracy in Athens, but it was democracy in a sense, but there were like, I don't know, 350,000 people living in Athens, but only about 35,000 citizens. So in a way, it was a kind of aristocracy under the name of democracy. So that was one reason. And in modern times, this is the most important point, it's the first example of founding, and they felt that if it failed, I'm exaggerating somewhat, it might be the last example of founding. That this was the test of liberal democracy, because liberal democracy was coming under attack by those who say, well, look, the Americans made a revolution in the name of liberal democracy, but the result is it can't function. And that's how the Federalists regarded the period in between the end of the Revolutionary War and the rewriting of the Constitution. It was a government that we had. It tried to do the ends, justify the ends of the Declaration, but it didn't succeed. And therefore, it would be held up for ridicule and set back the cause of democracy, well, maybe forever. So that's what made it an important one. Plus, I think they had to be careful in what they were saying. When they were writing the Federalist Papers, it wasn't clear that the Constitution would pass. So too much braggadocio might go a little too far. But I think they thought they were very qualified persons and that the document they produced was pretty good, likely to be better than anything created in the future. Say, for example, today, if you rewrote the Constitution, I suppose you'd have Nancy Pelosi as one of the delegates to the convention and Paul Ryan. I'm not sure that they really stack up to the ancient founders. But you can revere the founders too much in one sense by saying somehow they were, as Jefferson makes fun of them, smarter than we were. In effect, I do think they weren't smarter than we are, but they were smarter in the sense that they were devoted, the early founders, to politics. Politics in this period of American history, say from 1765 to 1795, was a period in which the greatest minds in America were all focused on politics. And that was the central activity at that point. The central activity, not only the central activity, they founded these state constitutions, and then not only did they found them, then they said, well, do they work or not? They were thinking about it and talking about politics all the time. So that's one reason, whereas today, I suppose the greatest minds are in technology or blogging and things like that. No one really wakes up with the idea, what are you going to do tomorrow? I'm going to found. It's sort of disappeared, and therefore the activities of human beings are placed elsewhere. And I think our political knowledge is less than the founders. I think that's fair to say, and I think they may have foreseen that likelihood. In fact, it was less by the time you got into the early 19th century when people began accepting the Constitution. They were no longer had the status of those who were active in political life all the time thinking about it. And if you want to make a partial defense of Jefferson, you could say maybe this is what he had in mind in calling for rewriting the Constitution in every generation, forcing people to be active and to think through politics to the beginning rather than accept something which is there because it's there. That's a pretty big risk that he took by this idea of rewriting the Constitution, but maybe that was one of the things that he had in mind. So that's what I would say about the founders. And the other question you had about virtue, yeah, now that's a big question, what one means by virtue. Virtue is different from, say, not kissing on the first date. That's an idea of virtue that we can set to one side. But virtue means, in a classical sense, loving the whole rather before oneself. So Marines or special forces, they put the whole, and they think of the whole before they think of their own benefit. But in a modern republic, it was realized to a large extent that people much of the time would not be like this. They'd be pursuing their own interests and prefer their self-interest to the good of the whole. At least think of that more often, more of the time. So this was a characteristic of modern government, modern life, but modern government. So still, the Federalist Papers indicates and other indicates that you do need virtue sometimes. There has to be sometimes where people come together and put the common good above private good. Rare moments, but that's important, and you can only hope that will be there, that when people are called upon to perform such an important test, that they'll be willing to do so. But it can't be guaranteed. I mean, if you study the regime of Sparta, which not many people do, but it's a good place to begin political science with the study of Sparta. Maybe they do it at Michigan State, as I mentioned, but boy, it's really clear. Everything in that society was organized to produce virtue. And you could say it was an armed camp designed to make the citizens believe in virtue. Oh, for example, money. What about money? Well, Lycurgus took care of money. He had his own economic policy, different than Mnuchin and others today, want to grow things and make things, economic growth obtain. His idea was you get away with gold and all those things, and you make your money in the form of these gigantic blocks of lead that are so difficult to transport that people don't want to buy anything. And forget about international trade. You can't ship the stuff, it's too difficult. So his purpose in political economy was to produce virtue, and everything else, sexual life in Sparta was organized in such a way as to produce virtue, and so on and so on. So it's an amazing thing to study because you see how every instrument of politics is bent towards the objective of obtaining virtue. That's a long way of filibustering, I guess, since you got me started.
I just wonder, as a constitutional scholar, if you have concerns for the Constitution going forward. You know, do you see the political battles of the day as representing a genuine threat to the integrity of the Constitution as it was intended by the founders?
But that's a tough question. Nothing lasts, I suppose, forever. But consider this. There's some small group of people, you hope, that will be devoted to the Constitution itself, no matter what the changes in American politics, no matter what the partisan balance, they will stand up for the Constitution, and they'll read it and study it and cherish it. And I think you need some people like that. When you actually look at the mechanism of American politics, it's a strange thing, is people come to the defense of different parts of the Constitution or the Constitution depending on political circumstances, and they switch sides. It's just that when they switch sides, the other side switch sides much of the time. So take the Democrats today, the progressives today. I mean, you go back to the Democrats under Obama, when Obama was president, and you know, their view was the Constitution really should be done away with. All power should be put in the executive, who's smart, intelligent. He can rule. Congress is the worst thing in the world. You don't need Congress, and so on and so forth. I think this was a common view of many people in the progressive movement, but where are they today? Oh, today all of a sudden, maybe it's just political, but they're all saying, you know, we need separation of powers. That's a pretty good thing. And what about Congress? It should be able to check the president. And plus, we should have a lot of power in the states. States are good things. So you can have drugs in a state like Colorado, I guess, and things like that. So defense of federalism. I don't know that these people are attached to the constitutional principles per se. I have my doubts, but that's their position. And Republicans have shifted sides a little bit too. They're no longer the simple defenders of things they once defended, like budget balancing. That seems to have gone by the wayside. I haven't heard anyone except a few people talk about budget balancing in the last few months. So as the political situation changes, happily, though not always, one side or another will defend the Constitution. And I think that's one of the things that keeps it going, without pure love of the Constitution prevailing in every situation. Will this last forever? I don't know. As they say, forever's a long time. But it's lasted an awful long time, longer than you know, any other comparable example that we have in the West. Yes, this gentleman here.
So I wonder if you have a particular Federalist that you think is underrated and why, and if you think there's one that's more overrated and why.
Rating now, the top 10. Well, given the musical and everything, you'd have to say that of the Federalists, we're not talking as a founder, you'd have to put Hamilton at the top of the list as one. He's given rise to a lot of good ditties from this musical. And I do think it's fair to say, whatever you think of Hamilton's actual politics, that he was one of the most intelligent persons that we encountered at that time, in the realm of politics, and therefore to be admired. I didn't live that long, but during the period he lived, he did some great things. I know some look at him and they don't like the fact that he wasn't always for free trade, and many economists say since the 1930s and 40s, as classical economics made its resurgence, have looked down upon Hamilton, saying he was more of a mercantilist and he didn't understand free trade. This is being rethought a little bit today in the political arena. In any case, Hamilton's defense of capitalism, and he was a kind of progenitor of capitalism, did include the idea of tariffs. And he made an argument that this was important at a certain stage of development, at an early stage of development, before there were any industries. You needed to protect your industries so that they could grow and then maybe drop your tariffs later on. Without those protections, these industries would never get their foot off the ground. So you could look at modern examples and find instances where this looks to be can be a pretty good policy. I mean, South Korea is an example. What did they do when they started developing? They put tariffs up, they defended their industries, and all of a sudden we're buying South Korean cars, South Korean TVs, and whatever else they produce. I think that period was necessary. Of course, then people try and hang on to the tariffs. But economics is a lot more complicated for those who don't understand it, which I'm a volunteer.
One more.
You know, you got to press, I guess, a little button there. Oh, it's on? Okay, good. No, it's on.
Working.
Yeah,
there it is.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, good. You talked before about the Madison's desire for veneration for the document, but also the fact that if you're voting for it, that sort of diminishes its veneration. Just seems like a necessary outcome of that. So would the long ratification process and the long discussion and the debates through the Federalist Papers and everything create enough of a distance and delay to make the vote something that one could in fact venerate?
Yeah, I guess you could say the whole process was involved, but the veneration was towards the Constitution itself. Walter Bagehot, British political thinker, he speaks of the efficient part of the Constitution. You know, that's what the Prime Minister does. But then the other function he mentions is the more sacred part of the Constitution. And that was identified with him with the crown in England. So, you know, if you look at it this way, people in England might dislike Prime Minister May, but their attachment to the nation is forged through this attachment to the crown. And so where in America do we find an attachment to the United States when you could say this role was supposed to be played by the president, who was the head of state, or maybe who stood above partisanship? That was Washington a little bit, made the effort. But I think, nothing against our current president, but I think the idea that the president standing above as a unifying force in America has lost a little bit ground since 2016 and even before. So what performs this function of attaching people to the nation that's not exactly considered partisan? And this is, I think, the Constitution has this other role. It's true that it sets out the powers of government, but a lot of people also say it's the Constitution, and it's to be respected in and of itself as something that holds America together. I'll use the word as a symbol. And if you look at the iconography in Washington of the Constitution in the National Archives building, Shiloh mentioned that I was on the Archives board, so I used to visit it a lot. When I went up to Washington, we held our meetings there. But it's like a temple. In fact, it was called a temple when I think Hoover was behind it. You enter, you used to enter, they've changed it now, but you used to enter. You walk up these mighty steps to the archive building, and there in front of you, ensconced in a great arc, is the Constitution of the United States. It has more than just the idea of a practical document like a state constitution. It has this symbolic function, which is a kind of veneration and reverence for something that's a symbol of the nation. So it's acquired that position over time, which I think has probably been a good thing for the United States.